Welcome to Mic Drop, the podcast where relevancy is irrelevant and we don't give a shit about your feelings.
Ladies and gentlemen, as always, it's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome my next guest to the podcast. This is actually her second time being here in light of recent events in Afghanistan. She's come back on the show to share her harrowing experiences that took place over the last 4 months or so there, from the end of July to December. She's formerly with Fox News. She's an international bureau journalist. She's the author of the amazing book, Only Cry for the Living. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Hollie McKay.
Thanks for having me again, Mike.
Thanks for coming back on. I know since you've been back, you've only been back for a few weeks, and it's been, from the sounds of it, quite the whirlwind of you doing other interviews and trying to get back on your feet and settled in. So I appreciate you bouncing around and taking the time to come here and share these experiences, because they're super important.
Thank you.
I'd like to take a quick second to shout out and thank our sponsor for today's podcast, Origin Labs and Jocko Fuel. Jocko Fuel is a great product. He's got a ton of products actually within the Jocko Fuel line. The guests and I enjoy them on the show. And outside, I take a lot of the supplements. I've got some of the Origin Lab jeans, boots, gis, and it's just all around American industry. They do a fantastic job really re-revolutionizing American industry from start to finish. It's all American made, all American sourced. Everything start to finish is made right there in-house. And they really do a phenomenal job creating the products and fulfilling the whole ball of wax. They've been a huge supporter of the Mic Drop podcast for a while now, and I really can't thank Jocko Fuel and Origin Labs enough for the job that they do for us. And so thank you to you guys.
I'd also like to talk about my brand of dog food that just came out.
What are the two key components for canine success? That's effective training and proper nutrition. Fueled by Team Dog brings those two components to your family and best friend. The perfect nutritional balance that results in a higher mental acuity, energy, overall vitality, and even an improved appearance. Every product you will find in my company's store was born from the battlefield and not from the boardroom. Let my life's work help you become your dog's hero.
What have you been up to? I guess we'll work kind of backwards since you've been back. How's the adjustment been from having been over there?
So I landed in New York. So at first it was a little bit strange. Being on roads that weren't bombed out and seeing shops that were open and, beauty salons and things. But I think it took me a little bit, maybe about a week, I think, to adjust back. And I was in Los Angeles, and then I've been staying with some friends of mine in Idaho. So nice and kind of quiet, hiding away for a little bit. So.
Yeah. Do you ski and all that, or what?
I don't. I used to, but then it was just one of those things that I got really injured years ago, and then decided I just didn't love it enough for it to be worth it.
Yeah. I hear you. So from that standpoint, I'm curious, when you come back, that initial kind of huge contrast from where you've been to where you now are, what goes through your mind when you experience that first kind of realization that you're not in Kansas anymore that way?
I think for me, it's a big struggle to leave. Like, I did not want to leave. I'm never ready to leave, even though this time I knew I had to leave. There was something that I was like, I think my time's up for now. I need to leave. But it was really, really difficult to leave. There was a lot of guilt, I think, in just being able to leave, being able to walk away, being able to get on that plane to Abu Dhabi and knowing that so many people would really kill to have that opportunity. And then it's just always hard, I think, coming back. I think when you are working overseas in a lot of these places, you can kind of exist in a bubble. So you can kind of, it's real life, but it's a different real life. And so in some ways, coming back is more stressful in a very different way.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with different pressures, you're dealing with just life stuff, and in some ways you can avoid that when you're not here.
Yeah. Was there difficulty in leaving? I know you mentioned the opportunity of you being able to, and so many people can't. What was it because you're a journalist or what?
It's because I'm Australian and American. I have a passport that enables me to leave, to be able to get onto that plane and to go. And I know that, so every day, even now, so many Afghans all day on LinkedIn, WhatsApp, wherever, are just begging me to help them get out. And I hate having to sort of point them in the direction of where they can get information, but it's not my job. I can't get you out. That's not what I do.
From a logistics standpoint, you hear on the news quite often, depending on which outlet it is, that there are still hundreds of American citizens there with credentials, et cetera, that aren't leaving or aren't able to leave. Can you kind of clarify or shed some light on that?
So there definitely are. And so when everyone else had sort of left and the evacuations had stopped, when the US left, and I made the decision that I wanted to stay, and everyone says, well, how are you going to get out? And I was pretty confident. I knew I would be able to get out. The first thing I did was go to the Pakistani embassy in Kabul and get a visa and a pass for the Torkham Gate, and that was more my backup in case the commercial airliners didn't start again. I felt fairly confident that I would be there for several months, and at some point the airlines would start again. Which they did. There are a couple of airlines that are running, I think, to Dubai. You can get a flight. You can also get a flight to Abu Dhabi, as I did, and then Islamabad. So I'm lucky in that sense. And I think there's no issue with American citizens leaving. The issue comes, just given the Afghan culture, is that it's not one person who wants to leave. They want to take their family. They want to take 20 members of their family. And so that's therein why they're not leaving. So if you have an American passport, provided that you aren't wanted by the Taliban or haven't committed a crime, they will let you leave. But many who are American citizens want to take a lot of people with them who aren't American citizens, and that's where I think some of the delay comes in.
Is the having committed a crime, is that subjective as far as?
I haven't sort of heard personally of anybody that's been necessarily stopped, but I do know that the Taliban, like if you worked for the previous government and you're wanted for corruption, or they think that you stole a lot of money, which happened a lot in the previous government, the Taliban might try to stop you from leaving. But I haven't heard of that happening at a large scale. Most people that I know who have wanted to get out have gotten out on those flights, but certainly, it could definitely be subjective. I just know that, they do have a list.
Yeah. I guess that's the thing that I wonder about hearing. Again, you hear these horror stories from a lot of different, outlets that talk about, the retribution component of having worked for the American government or the previous, Afghan administration and what. I can't imagine there's databases, right? So they're just, what are they, handwritten lists that...
Yeah, and I think, and this isn't a popular fact, but it's a fact, but people don't want to hear, the retribution issue has been very much exaggerated by the media. If I wasn't in Afghanistan and I was just reading Twitter, I would have thought, oh my goodness, people are being dragged out of their houses, they're being slaughtered, and certainly there are isolated cases of that happening, but they're very few and far between. It's very much the exception, not the norm. And I think what I sort of sensed was there was this contagious fear that was happening. So somebody felt that because they'd worked for an American 10 years ago or a contracting company or whatever it may be, they automatically just assumed they were going to be targeted, and everybody around them was scared. So everybody, there was this contagious fear. When you actually dug down into it, there wasn't, there were only a sort of a select few, perhaps the commandos and people that had done a lot of very heavy work against the Taliban. They were the only ones that were really on those target lists. For the most part, there wasn't the sort of certified threat or case of, it was just a lot of fear that was happening. And rightfully so. It, certainly is terrifying for people.
Yeah. Why do you suppose the media on the American side was so over-exaggerated that way?
I don't know, really, to be honest. I think, honestly, there wasn't that many journalists there. Really, once the Americans had left, the journalists that were there were usually European journalists that I saw, and the big outlets still had people there, but oftentimes they weren't American. So I think there was just a lack of coverage that was happening on the ground. And I just think things just got very much perpetuated on social media, and news outlets, because they didn't have people on the ground, were then relying on diaspora or secondhand information, and it was just spreading like wildfire. And to me, I was researching a lot of these things that were happening and photos that were being shared, and there was a lot of disinformation campaigns, and they were coming from a lot of different countries and a lot of different people with different agendas. And I think somehow that got picked up. And I don't want to downplay any of the terrible things that happened, because there certainly were. But I just think on the large scale, the degree to which it was being portrayed was just not accurate to what was actually happening.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. I guess it is probably a good litmus or metric for how our media is for everything over here. I mean, everything seems to get over-exaggerated in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of things get under-exaggerated or not enough coverage. From a communication standpoint, being over there, I'm curious about Twitter access, internet access, power, things like that. As a journalist, and that being the main vein with which you communicate back to all of us here, how shaky was that, and what kind of infrastructure issues are there with, once the United States completely pulled out and now the Taliban is kind of at the helm? Was there a big shift or no? How did that all kind of shake out?
I mean, one thing, there's no real blockage on the internet or anything like that in Afghanistan. And that's one thing I actually liked always about working in Afghanistan, was unlike working in a lot of places, Syria or somewhere where you are under a dictatorship where things are restricted, Afghanistan kind of feels like the Wild West. Like there's just, they can't sweep the streets, let alone restrict the internet. So that really didn't change when the Taliban took over. Electricity has always been bad in Afghanistan. It did get a little bit worse, and it certainly gets worse during the winter. My understanding is that Uzbekistan basically loaned $60 million of electricity to the Talibans on credit. So, the Taliban doesn't have any money to pay for it. Yeah. So there were certainly days where you'd go days without electricity, and typically, it would cut out at around midnight usually, and not come back on maybe until 9 or so during the day. So that period, we don't have electricity. But that always happened, even before the Taliban was in power. And
weather-wise, where you were at, it was fairly mild. It wasn't a big deal.
I traveled a lot, so I pretty much went to almost every province when I was there. So it was really depending on where I was. But Kabul got really cold really quickly. So we kind of went from this searing heat, and then in the beginning of October, it just, you felt that drop, and then by December it was snowing. So and the situation certainly gets pretty awful during the winter. It's not a nice place to be.
Yeah. So moving back to when you first decided to go over there, when you did, can you walk us through A, your train of thought, and B, just logistically, like how that took place?
So I'd spent a bit of time in Afghanistan in the past, and I decided that I thought it was really important to sort of cover the Americans leaving Afghanistan. I thought this was a real milestone in our history. And so my thinking was, and I teamed up with a good friend of mine, a photographer in Australia named Jake Simkin, who spent he lived in Afghanistan for many years, and we worked together in the Middle East. And so we thought we'd go back and document, I guess, that final month of the US, and then the couple of months after, which we thought would be the Afghan government trying to stand on its own 2 feet while still fighting the Talibans. And we sort of got there, and I couldn't have imagined that things fell as fast as they could. It was just so quick.
So just not to get you off a train of thought, but from the amount of time that you've spent there, were there huge disparities in what you thought would happen as far as how the U.S. left and what the response would be versus what happened? I mean, I know you said you couldn't have imagined, but I know for a lot of us back here, seeing the process with which the United States left was very shocking.
Yeah.
But I guess in thinking that, what was your train of thought while that was taking place, other than surprise? I mean, what were you expecting, I guess?
I think it was inevitable that things were going to fall, but I didn't think Kabul would fall not that quickly, and I just didn't think the speed of which it happened. I wasn't expecting that. And sort of to give you some context, that first week when I was there and I was meeting with the NDS, the Afghan security teams and the commandos, and every one of them was just swearing black and blue that was going to be okay, that Kabul was going to hold, that Mazar was going to hold, that all these major cities were going to hold. And I think they really believed it. And so with them believing it, I guess we believed it to some degree, that at least it was going to be okay for a couple of weeks, if not months. Certainly the withdrawal was really chaotic, and so many missteps that happened in that, and it should never have happened that way. But I think somehow there was just so many blinders on, in the sense that there was a failure of intel, there was a failure of really understanding, I guess, the power that the Taliban had that people didn't realize, their numbers, their ability to, and they've been started, and I always say it wasn't for them. They won not by firing bullets. They won by having tea with local officials and convincing them to leave. They won through talks. And I think somehow we missed that. We missed that this had been going on very extensively behind the scenes for a year before it had happened.
Why do you suppose we missed that?
I have a few different theories on it. I think one of the things I noticed in previous times in Afghanistan was there was just sort of a lack, I think, when I would go to the NATO base there and I would talk to diplomats and to military, there seemed to be a lack of understanding how the regular Afghan thought. And what I really noticed was the people that were coming, and especially after Benghazi, they really shut down a lot of those embassies, and people weren't allowed to leave and go to the streets and things and have that interaction that they were able to have in previous years, where you could really understand what was happening. And so after that, I think what I noticed was that the people coming in were coming in already, they were vetted, they had very much a one-track stream of information. And I think there was a lack of really understanding that people were really unhappy with the Afghan government, that people were just fed up with the corruption, that people were angry. And I think when you get that angry, even if you don't agree with the Taliban's ideologically, you join them because you're so annoyed at having to pay a bribe every time you go through a checkpoint, or having to, daily life was just really hard for Afghans. They're already poor, and yet they're having to give these people, money just to get basic services. And I think there was an underestimation of how the degree to which that was happening, and then in that, how the Taliban was able to use that as a recruitment tool and get support. I just think the big picture was missed.
Yeah. Why do you think that the United States either allowed or had no idea that all of this Afghan corruption that they essentially condone, if they're kind of behind the process, et cetera? Or I guess it's as much of a question as, do you think that they knew? Did you know that we knew?
I think the U.S. absolutely knew. They absolutely knew, but it was viewed as corruption is just systemic in this part of the world. Not much we can do about it, and they sort of thought it wasn't that big of a priority to deal with. Whereas, to me, that corruption was really the number one thing that opened the floodgates to the Talibans. Mm-hmm. They were able to use that as their recruiting tool, still use that as this sort of message of, we aren't corrupt, we're going to do things a very different way. And it was just it was on every possible level. Like, even when I thought I knew about corruption, I would hear stories from Afghans, and it blew my mind. It just blew my mind, and it made me really angry. And I would say to them, I take it personally because that was my money as a U.S. taxpayer. I paid for that corruption, and you stole my money. That money should have gone to the Afghan people, and it didn't. It went to the pockets of a lot of corrupt people. You had cases of judges creating fake trials just so they could get bribe money. You had people just being arrested so that they could get money to be released. Like, it just, you had to pay thousands of dollars to get an interview at the US Embassy through a middle person, whoever was arranging that. At what point does that become too much? Yeah. And at what point do you say, this is not my government anymore? I'm going to support someone else who wants to fight this government. And the US was very aware of that. And I think in the cigar reports, I think a couple of years ago, they warned, they said corruption is the number one threat to Afghan society. Again, nothing was done about it. And if you don't nip those things in the bud right in the beginning, they just grow and proliferate, and nobody was held accountable. There's rarely cases of people ever being held accountable or prosecuted or anything.
Would you say that from a most egregious standpoint of the stories of corruption that you heard, that those are the examples, or is there one that sticks out as being kind of the worst that you'd heard? I
mean, I think with that is not really one story, that it's just every story. Yeah. Just every story. And I think at the end of the day, if you look at the Afghan military on paper, there's 300,000 troops. Okay, well, 300,000 troops should be able to hold out the Taliban. But in reality, there wasn't 300,000 troops. In reality was that the commandos were taking, so somebody would die in battle, they would take their bank card and still be withdrawing their salary every month. They would create, what we call ghost soldiers. So they were creating people that never existed, or that had left the military or were dead, but were still taking the money. So when the US looks at the paperwork and says, oh, okay, well, there's 300,000 soldiers, they should be able to take on this task, in reality, they were severely outnumbered because there just wasn't that many.
Yeah. So I guess with that, did you see a shift as soon as we left and the Taliban took over, where they actually did what they said they were going to do, and there was a lot less of that? Have you seen that contrast?
A lot less of which?
The corruption.
Well, they don't have money to be corrupt right now. So right now, they're still playing by their, Mullah Omar founded the Taliban to say that we aren't going to be corrupt. And generally speaking, I didn't encounter too much of that. There was one person in Helmand, a Taliban culture minister who wanted money for something, and we basically just said no. But that was the only time anyone had kind of asked, whereas in the previous government, it was just expected that you paid. Yeah. So far, we don't know what will happen when they get money, but right now they don't have money to be corrupt.
So with that's one of the dicey things that I think you see, how our government and current administration is trying to walk that line or tap dance around. Do we, authenticate them as far as considering them a legitimate government? Do we treat them that way? Do we talk to, as well as a lot of other countries? What is your kind of perspective on A, how it's going, and B, how countries should look at them?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult on multiple levels. Obviously, nobody wants to directly fund the Taliban, and I completely agree with that. But at the end of the day, it's the Afghan people that are suffering. And right now, Afghanistan is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And the speed of that, how that happened. So when we say we're not going to, we froze the money as soon as the Taliban came in, and we say we're not going to support them in any way, it's not the Taliban who's hurt by that. That's the Afghan people. The Taliban operate, they say we can operate on low overhead. They never got, their foot soldiers don't get paid. They never got paid for 20 years. So it's really the Afghan people that are suffering hugely. And I think that we need to figure out a way to get aid to them that doesn't go through the Taliban. And that's always difficult when they are the government that's in power. But there has to be a way around that in some way. I don't think it's right to turn a blind eye, especially, after being there for 20 years and I guess creating a very artificial economy that went bust overnight. I also look at it a little bit from a national security perspective, in that if you look at when the Taliban first came to power in 1996, there was no more pariah government in the world. There was no government that was as ostracized as the Taliban. And they had no money. Nobody gave them money. Nobody supported them. The one person who came in and gave them not much money, it was only about $1.5 million, was Osama bin Laden. So naturally, they felt very akin to accommodating him because he was the only one that was giving them a tiny bit of money to stay afloat. And I think it would be tone deaf if we don't take into consideration history and how we can avoid those mistakes of the past.
For sure. I mean, I think it's natural and expected for a country in that level of need to feel beholden to anybody that helps them out. I guess I wonder what the next steps are. To your point, it's always difficult to administer aid to people that need it through governments. I mean, you see that we've seen that historically. Somalia, I think, is as good of example in our nation's foreign policy history as to how that can ultimately lead to us getting back involved in taking military action to prevent that. I don't know what that right answer is. I hate to see the level of misery and just the things that are taking place in Afghanistan now are heartbreaking for sure. I don't know what the right answer is.
I don't think there is a right answer. I think we have to choose what the least worst answer is because they're all sort of bad. And
is there one that sticks out for you in terms of the least worst, or in the interest of not turning a blind eye, but not fueling a terrorist government?
Sure, I don't. I mean, the level of malnutrition. I mean, we went to one of the public hospitals. It was sort of in my last week there, and there's babies all over the floor that are just so severely malnourished that their hair has turned white, and the mothers are just on the floor trying to breastfeed them. It's just heartbreaking. And when you have to look into their faces, and I would walk outside and people hadn't been paid their salaries, and the nurses and the doctors would just accost me and be like, "Can you pay my salary for me?" It was just heartbreaking. And I think as an American, we can't walk away from that. That, this is a place we've been for 20 years, and I don't think nobody wants to see that in Afghanistan. And so for me, obviously, I'd like to see, some sort of sanction relief and that aid organizations can go back in, because what happened really was so many of them left immediately and haven't gone back. And there are some complications with that. And I would like to see a lot of the aid organizations be able to go back. The big issue is money and not being able to access any money while there, but they definitely need that support. And if the US, eventually has to come to some sort of talks with the Taliban, which they already have talks with the Taliban in Doha and have been doing that for several years, it has to come with conditions. And it has to come, you can't just hand free money over to the Taliban. They have to be able to be held accountable to certain objectives in the international community and beholding international human rights standards. And if they don't do that, there has to be some sort of accountability in that way.
Do you think, so just in thinking through it, from my perspective, not that anybody's asking me what the fuck I think, but setting up almost refugee-style camps within the country, but in the outskirts of towns or in areas where they're not going to be easily accessible or can get railroaded or run over by forces that would try to steal everything from them or whatever, to at least establish a basic level of care for women, children, sick people, what have you, so they're at least nourished to a level where things like that aren't happening, and keep them alive and healthy and relatively safe, with the condition of, hey, we're going to bring international aid in from all different countries, and whether it's international aid groups or what have you, but they come in, they set the camps up, they basically run them, and people can come into them freely, unfettered. And if the Taliban or any group comes in and tries to get in between that, whether it's taking some of the aid or money or supplies or whatever, then there will be military action. Basically, we'll come back in and do the same thing. Is that a realistic?
It certainly is a realistic to have some kind of food bank. The issue with the Taliban is that they do try to control a lot of those things. I have friends of mine that were doing a lot of those aid drops and things, and the Taliban was always, it would cause a lot of conflict because the Taliban was always trying to control it, and not in that they were trying to steal it, but they want the credit for it. Afghanistan isn't a huge camp place, unlike other countries that I've worked in, say Iraq or Syria, where you have these big camps. There aren't so many of those in Afghanistan. There was a really big one outside sort of this park in Kabul, which was very informal. And it was one of the things that really surprised me because this was just several days before Kabul fell. And I was there and there were just thousands of people fleeing from the north and trying to set up these little tents. And I remember that baffled me because there was no preparation at all for what was happening. But Afghans are, it's not a huge sort of camp place, and I think that comes down to a few things. Often you don't see a huge amount of homeless people there because it's such a family-orientated place that families will always take people in where they can, and it sort of doesn't matter if 10 people are living in a room on the floor. It's a place that you see a lot of that. And so I just don't know how receptive, I guess, people would be to an actual camp itself. But certainly if there's a food bank or some sort of drive, or they can go and get medical checks and supplies. But again, there's no medicine in the country. There's no, it's really, really difficult right now.
So how does that impact you when you're there for a 4-month period? How are you getting
it was challenging.
Money, food?
Yeah.
Because I remember seeing reports and stories of banks being closed or only open for like an hour, and there's lines a mile long to get money. Like, how do you survive?
So I took in a bunch of cash before I went, but that quickly kind of ran out. So I couldn't. It was really, really hard. Like, even if I had friends of mine trying to send me Western Union transfers, there was no physical cash to get the transfer. So I'd go to the Western Union and they would just say, I'm sorry, we don't have any money today.
Wow.
Try to come back tomorrow. So in the end, I sort of had to rely on people coming in from Dubai to bring money in for me, to bring in cash, because there's just no hard cash. So what happened when the government fell and the banks kind of closed, people couldn't even get their own money. So people were coming from all these provinces, lining up for days, and there was a maximum of $200 you were allowed to get out of your own bank account per week. That did increase to $400 by the time I'd left. But Afghanistan doesn't print its own money. It all gets done in Europe, so that got shut down. So there was no actual new currency coming in.
What is exchange rate wise? What is $400 going to get you in a week?
Oh, so that is not much right now. So what happened, and this kind of gives you an idea of just how quickly things fell. So when I got there initially, I think it was about 70 Afghanis to the US dollar. And by the time I'd left, that had gone up to 100.
Wow.
So that's how much it devalued.
Okay.
Like, it's just, it's dizzying I've never seen a currency drop in value so much.
Sounds like crypto almost.
Right.
Bouncing around.
Unpredictable.
So with that, that's 400 Afghani dollars that they can take out a week?
Well, it's the equivalent of 200 American. Or 400 American now. So it's,
And then from just kind of the way, I mean, I know you traveled around a lot, but was it fairly consistent as far as most stores, shops, restaurants, grocery stores, places like that you can actually get food, or are those few and far between, or was
the food is there for sure? Shops really opened back up very quickly. But again, it's people can't afford to buy what's there. It's not that the markets aren't full. It's that the markets people just can't afford to buy what's there anymore. Yeah. So something that's very staple in Afghan culture is you buy one of those big pieces of bread, and it's always 10 Afs. And so by the end of it, you started to see, it was still 10 Afs for the bread, which is very cheap, but you started to see the bread get really small because they wanted to keep it 10 Afs because that's what Afghans were used to paying, but suddenly it's half the size of what it used to be.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So what, can you walk us through, like, was there a typical day there of what time you got up, what you did, or was it just different every day?
Yeah, it was different every day depending on which province I was in. But when we had a house in Kabul, so, I mean, that typically, would start, I'd often get up, very early, try to do some sort of pathetic workout in my bedroom. I used to try to work out in the yard outside until it got really cold. So usually I'd travel with a jump rope and a few things and annoy everybody in the house because it just
the crazy lady
vibrates. Everyone's like, oh, Hollie's up. Yeah. So I'd sort of get up early and do that. And then, so we would usually start the day pretty early in terms of doing meetings and interviews because the older ministries, like once the Taliban took over, the ministries all pretty much closed by 1 o'clock. So they work half a day. Yeah. Not a full day of work. Yeah. And oftentimes they're not even at the ministry. They're at the mosque doing their meetings. So it was always very hard to track people down. So we usually, the mornings were going out, kind of doing the meetings and getting whatever content that I needed. And then I always had a restaurant that I always went to when I went to Afghanistan. So I was very happy it was still open. And usually went there for lunch and smoked some hookah.
What did you eat there?
I didn't. I'm usually very much a carnivore person, but when I was in Afghanistan, I don't know what happened. I could not eat. I could not eat the meat. I could not eat even the chicken. I could just. It's hanging up on the. You walk past the butchers, you still see the cow that's being skinned. I was like, maybe not for me today. Yeah. So I love Afghan yogurt though. It's really good.
Yeah.
They make fresh yogurt there. So I kind of lived on that really, and a lot of tea. And the Afghan bread is really hard to avoid. And so I went to a restaurant, sort of had a nice little outdoor area. It was called Herat. And it was sort of one of the places you could still go and smoke hookah, even though it was banned by the Taliban. But
really?
Yeah.
Do you know why?
Well, the Taliban just banned smoking. You're not allowed to smoke. I
figured
still
that they would smoke all the time. But
well, they do.
Yeah.
You see them sneaking in. I think in their homes they do, but there's no smoking on the street or anything like that.
What were some of the other big shifts that way as soon as they took over that were now all of a sudden were banned or that was different?
Music.
Really?
No music. So I think you used to be able to kind of walk down the street and there was always a lot of entertainment. People would sit there on their phones and their iPads or computers and watch movies and there was a big sort of focus on that. And then that was sort of immediately squashed. Taliban views music as being haram, as being, sinful, and they have their own style of music, which is a nasheed, which is basically just Islamic vocals, and there's no instruments. So that was a big thing that changed, was just that sort of immediate shift.
So they don't, like, even with headphones or something, they don't want you
I still blast music in the car. I just turn it down when I get to the checkpoint. Yeah. But so weddings, for example, which are a big part of Afghan culture, no more live music. They would still allow the women's side of the weddings to have a DJ of some description, so the women can still have some music, but there's no live music. They're very anti-instruments, very anti...
Do you know why there's that correlation from their standpoint? That
they just view it as going back to the hadiths, they view music as sort of being this sinful thing. And then I think they also see it as this Western sort of terrible influence on their culture that is...
Do they view dancing the same way?
Pretty much, yeah.
It's like Footloose all over again.
Yeah, it totally is. But people, again, at weddings, like people still sort of get away with it until there was a case when I was there in Jalalabad where the Taliban came into a wedding and ended up in a gunfight because they were upset about the music and dancing that was happening, and then people there sort of fought back. So, yeah.
Is do you get the impression that the people are willing to put up with that because it's hopefully getting rid of corruption, or what do you think the kind of the overall pulse of the society is right now with how it's going?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think in cities like Kabul, it's really devastating to lose those things. I think it's devastating to feel like you're being plunged back into some medieval era, and especially for people that remember what it was like living under the Taliban in the 90s, which in my experience, they're very different to what they were in the 90s. But just that memory is extremely terrifying. So I think the cities is where people suffer really a lot. But when you go to a lot of the rural areas in the villages, you have to acknowledge that their lives may get better. And that is because they're very conservative societies anyway. The Taliban often had a very strong influence anyway, and they were places where women didn't necessarily go to school and were often in the homes. And so the way they view it is, well, my life isn't going to change, but now suddenly the violence has gone down a whole heap. So therefore, my life's going to get better. So, and I think it's important to kind of look at their experiences too. I think oftentimes so much of the journalism comes just from the cities like Kabul or Kandahar or Jalalabad, and we forget looking at the experience of people in villages and what they're going through and how things are going to change, and they're very different to the cities.
Yeah. So with that, I guess, did you get an impression from some of those rural areas that they were kind of relieved that we were gone and things were going back to that and that things were looking up?
I think so. And it really, again, it depends what villages you are in and how much of a hold the Taliban had in that area before. But I think for the most part, people just viewed it as the violence is going down. And also, too, in a lot of the areas that had strong Taliban control previously, they never really saw any of the benefits from the US being there. They never saw, great educational programs started or any of those sort of Hearts and Minds project, because the area was often very Taliban heavy and therefore not really a particularly safe place for any of the US military to go. So for them, because they didn't see the benefit, they only saw the fighting, it's positive for them. And some of them genuinely, they want the Taliban. They see the Taliban, they agree with the sort of that extremist ideology, and that's how they want to be able to live their lives.
Yeah. Do you get the impression that, and I know there's some people that love us, hate us, et cetera, but kind of collectively what Afghanistan thinks about our time that we spent there and how they kind of look back on it?
Yeah, I think, again, that really depends village versus city areas. And I think a lot of the city areas, really right up until that last day, somehow believed that Americans were not going to leave. And they viewed America as being this sort of Band-Aid over a bullet wound, I guess, in that, okay, the situation was incredibly tense, but somehow it was this security blanket. Even though there wasn't that many American forces there, I think there was about 2,500 prior to that final drawdown. And they weren't really doing any of the heavy lifting. That was being done by the Afghans. But they viewed it as this superpower being there, that it was going to be some sort of security blanket that would sort of keep things held together. And so when that was sort of ripped away, I think that was a big shock to them. I think there were a lot of people who just thought that America would somehow see what was happening and stay. And then there were others who were very much of the sort of mindset of, well, Americans are going to leave eventually, whether it's now, whether it's in 10 years, whether it's 100 years, they will go home, and Afghans need to figure this out on their own. I was always surprised, though, because I rarely found anyone to be bitter about Americans either leaving or, people were obviously scared and upset, but people weren't angry at America. People weren't bitter toward America. They were accepting of the situation and just trying to figure out what they were going to do next.
Yeah. Sounds like they're more resilient towards us than we are ourselves towards our own government.
Yeah, I would say
or
that.
Less dependent, at least.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that.
If you could kind of, I guess, give your kind of walkthrough of when you first got there and then leading up to when everything fell. I'm curious kind of what that process looked like.
So I got there and you were in this situation, and as I said, I was meeting with NDS, I was meeting with different people, and everybody was. It was obviously bad situation in the north, especially, but people were fairly confident that the capital and some of the major areas would hold. And so, having said that, I several years ago had met with Marshal Dostum in Ankara in Turkey, and so. For people that aren't familiar, he was sort of the main person that the US went in through Mazar Sharif into Afghanistan after 9/11, and kind of took out the Taliban. And he's a very controversial sort of warlord who who got in trouble for some human rights violations later on. But anyway, so his forces, he'd come back into Afghanistan, and his forces were teaming up. His resistance forces were teaming up with Afghan commandos in the north and were fighting. And so we thought we would go to Mazar on his invitation to document some of their battles. So my photographer and I left. I remember it was very early on a Thursday morning, and we got to Mazar, and it was just this city that was completely full of life. Markets were full, people were out. You would not have imagined that all the provinces around it had fallen and that you had these battles less than 50 miles away, because everything was just very normal. People were getting on with life. I remember going out that night, and it was just completely full of life. And I remember thinking to myself, like, how is this place on the verge of falling? I don't understand. And then Friday, you started to see things quieten a little bit. It was very strange. And that night, I went out with some of the commandos, and again, they were convinced things weren't going to fall. And then I was going. We left at about 2 a.m. and they were supposed to call me at around 6 to go back out to the front line the next day on that Saturday. And the call never came. And I'm waiting, and it didn't happen. But that day was so bizarre. So we went out, and you just saw the streets were dead, the shops were closed, and you saw people lining up outside the bank, just trying to get whatever money they could, because everybody was trying to flee to Kabul. And we went to, there's a beautiful, big blue mosque in Mazar, and we went there, and you saw more people just fleeing from these outside villages, and they were in these tiny rickshaws. And we were trying to get an interpreter, and everyone we knew had left the city. And finally got somebody, and we're driving, and you just see these abandoned buildings and people coming in, and the cab driver is just, I'm scared. And then the next minute, the guy on the phone said, they've broken through the first of these 3 front lines. And I knew at that point, the earliest commercial flight that I could get back to Kabul wasn't until Monday evening. So I thought,
how far is that from?
It's about 300 miles. So it's about, if you were to drive, which you couldn't at that point because the Taliban controlled all the roads, but it's a 12-hour drive. And then, so I went back to my hotel, and it was just, by that evening, we went out and it was just empty. When we went to this kebab cafe, my photographer Jake and I, and we looked at each other and went, something's wrong here. Like, something is about to happen. And so we started to hurry kind of back to the hotel. And as we're hurrying back, the Talibans just came in on motorcycles and were shooting in the air, and that was it, really. And I didn't quite know what was happening, and we're on the roof sort of looking out. It was this glass roof, and you just saw hundreds of them pouring in, and they're all shooting. And I'm on the phone to a friend of mine in London who used to be a diplomat in Afghanistan. He's Afghan. And he's like, Mazar's just fallen. I said, what do you mean it's just fallen? And he said, yeah, it's fallen. And so we sort of had to deal with, okay, so now I don't know what this means, but I've got to figure it out.
And how long was this after you'd been there?
This was 2.5 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was there a sense from your standpoint that there was a very coordinated effort on the Taliban's part to move through it the way, say, the United States would in a conventional war? Did it seem that organized and strategic as far as forces taking certain towns and moving through certain areas?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to there was certainly the combat element, but they were cutting deals with local commanders, with local warlords, with local officials. Again, this is where the corruption comes back into play. The Taliban was basically cutting these deals. These people that had cut the deals were then able to leave freely, leave the country, wherever it was. And you had all these Afghan soldiers that were just left to the slaughter. And that really upset me, because, again, it's easy to say they ran away, they did all these things, and I understand the frustration with that. But they were really sold out.
Yeah.
And even the Safi, the guy that I'd been out with the night before, the commander who really believed in Afghanistan, was a wonderful sort of patriot. And when I finally got back in touch with him, I said, what happened? Are you okay? And he'd fled. And he basically said 4:00 that afternoon, he'd been out fighting. His 3 bodyguards had been killed. And he just got a call that said, your commander had left, Marshal Dostum's left, everybody's gone. So you can continue to fight, or you can actually just run away and save your life. And at that point, it was a losing game. So what were they going to do? So, they had to run, really. Yeah. There wasn't an alternative for them. They were not going to win. They'd already been sold out.
Yeah. I want to get into that a little deeper here in just a second, but I want to take one step back. You mentioned that the Taliban actually were cutting deals with some of the higher-ups from a corruption standpoint. So I'm curious if they're kind of, from an undertone standpoint, trying to build up a resistance to the existing government, bitching about corruption, but then they're essentially kicking their campaign off by essentially doing the same thing.
Yeah, essentially. I don't think they have the money to be offering huge amounts of money to them, but certainly able to offer them safety or family safety, things like that they were able to offer. And I think it just sort of became one of those things where people saw it as inevitable that they were going to take over. So if I have a free passage to get out and take my family with me, I'm going to take it.
Would you say that single point of failure wise, that at that time the existing Afghan leadership militarily fit that box of the single point of failure of being the reason why it fell so quick is because of that mentality that you're speaking of?
I think so. I think it certainly played a huge part of it. I think Afghans, they were trying to fight for a government that really didn't fight for them. And I think that people joined the military because it was a basic wage in a country that's very poor. I don't think they necessarily a lot of them had the conviction to win. It was more just a survival tactic to join. And the Taliban really infiltrated that in ways. And I think one thing we really saw when the Taliban came back was that just the level to which they had already infiltrated every layer of the government, of the military. They had people I knew for a long time suddenly came out and said, oh yeah, I've been 20 years a Taliban. I'm like, how did I not know this? You used to party with us in Kabul. Like, what is happening here? So I just think they had it in motion for a long time, and they played the long game.
Yeah.
They played the long game for a long time, and in that final sort of last year or so, that's where they really went for it. And they're very strategic about it. I think often we look at the Taliban as this sort of ragtag mountain militia, but they were very strategic in the way that they took the country.
Yeah. I mean, from my experience in a few different areas of the Middle East, that seems to be a pretty recurring theme of a mentality that is very, very contrasted from ours that way. In that, the reflections on even something as far back as the Crusades is more relevant to their society as far as how they view us and how they view the world is much, much more like millennia based than it is, a couple of years or one military campaign to the next, which it's interesting. You would think that as many times as we as a nation have learned that lesson that we would remember it, but we seem to not do that.
And they have this ideological conviction that I found to be fascinating. And again, it goes back to the foot soldiers aren't getting paid. So what happens is, say somebody from a family will sponsor that particular person to be in the Taliban. And so all their brothers will, give money to that person. So they're very much used to being, going days without food, going days without any kind of comforts. That is not a thing to them. But what they have is this conviction and this belief that Afghanistan must be this Islamic country. And they have this belief that I think is really hard, that the Afghan military was never able to replicate.
Yeah.
Because the Taliban were not doing it for money. They were not doing it for anything other than they believed that they were going to get back in power and make Afghanistan this Islamic country that they wanted it to be, that they felt wasn't happening under the previous government.
Was there a mechanism that you saw that was the reason why they meaning the Taliban leadership, able to inspire and motivate their fighters to be that hard-lined? How do they do that?
So they usually, most of the members, they usually go to a madrasa. So when
they're kids, right?
Yeah, they're lucky to be educated up to, 6th, 9th grade. If they're lucky to go to a normal school, then they will go to a madrasa normally, and that can be either on the Afghan side, or there's certainly a number of them on the Pakistan side of the border, and they basically get indoctrinated there, and then it's sort of just a rite of passage that you join the Taliban once you're done with the madrasa. So and they don't really have an age, still don't have an age joining. Obviously, by international law, you're supposed to not be in combat under the age of 18, but Taliban, as long as you can grow a beard, you're good to go. Yeah. So that's their.
I wouldn't have been able to fight till I was 30.
That's their metric. Yeah. So, and the other thing, that I also found, so there was that side of people, and that's one of the reasons they joined. But then you had another side of people. I'll give you an example, sort of Siraj Haqqani, who is obviously wanted by the US, but he is the Minister of Interior. So his spokesperson is a guy named Kari Hosty. And when I asked Kari Hosty, why did you join the Taliban? And he was quite an educated, spoke very good English. He said, I was going to madrasa. I wasn't a Taliban. I was just very deeply devoted to my Islamic studies. And he said he was arrested and put in Bagram prison for many years and tortured by Afghan forces, he claims. And he said when he had his hearing, there was nobody there that he was able to hire. He wasn't able to hire a lawyer, anyone that kind of represented him. And so the minute he was released from jail, the first thing he did was join the Taliban. Wow. So you also had I found a lot of people, that was also the motivating factor for them, was something had happened to them. They'd been put in jail. They'd been threatened in some way. And so they wanted to fight against that.
Yeah. Going back to the dropping of weapons and not fighting kind of critique that was fairly prevalent, something especially in the veteran community, that especially for guys that knew some of the fighters that have been there for multiple deployments, even you, I'm curious to get your perspective on it from this standpoint, which is, it's hard to imagine, and I know it's easy to sit here in our society when you can drive through Starbucks and you slept on a comfortable bed with heat or air conditioning on and what have you, all the creature comforts that most people take for granted and don't even realize are something they should appreciate. But it's a lot easier to sit in that environment and say, why didn't you fight? And I certainly am not naive to that. However, having spent a fair bit of time in the Middle East in a lot of different places myself, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around putting myself in that position here, where I just can't imagine not saying, you know what, if I die, so be it. But I refuse to live in a country that is my home, where I'm being dictated to by, some extremist government that is going to do these things to me that I'm just not going to live with, literally. I try to wrap my mind around where they're at. I get being sold out. I still think, or I like to think, maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, I don't know, but I feel like in that same scenario here, I would still be a masked gunman running around causing as much trouble as possible until the very bitter end, kind of no matter what. But and there's been some pretty harsh criticism from a lot of guys in the veteran community, and it's interesting because some are very critical of Afghanis and others are very empathetic to the point where they're even going over there trying to help get them out. And I don't know why there's such a contrast that way, but I'm curious to get your take on that.
I certainly see the frustrations, and I really think for many years the Afghan forces, the number of people the soldiers that died, they won't even release the death count because it's just so high.
I'm sure it's hundreds of thousands, right?
It's so I think for a long time they did try. I don't know why, but they never got to that point of the fight or die. There's few of them, whereas the Taliban have that. They have the fight. They begging to be suicide bombers because they see that as being a heroic thing. But the Afghan forces just never got to that point where I think toward the end of it, they just viewed the loss as inevitable. And so they could either die fighting or they can try to save their own life and run. Yeah. And I just think they never got to that point in a mentality sense. I just think, again, are you fighting for a government that doesn't fight for you?
Yeah.
And how hard is it to reach that point where you are willing to give up your life for that. And I just think the patriotism just was never quite there.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, people just sort of joined for that basic salary. But the will to fight, it just didn't carry through to the end.
Yeah. All right. So back to kind of your chronological timeline of being there. A couple days in, you watched that city fall. Basically, where did you go after that? And
so I was sort of trapped in the hotel for a while, which wasn't completely fun. At that point, we really didn't have any idea how the Taliban was going to respond to foreigners, to journalists, to a woman, and so it was very much this unknown. And the only Taliban that I guess I really knew was the insurgent Taliban. So yeah, it was certainly an uncomfortable time because we didn't know and we didn't have the contacts. Everybody had left to kind of be able to go and directly speak to them. And at the time, Kabul had fallen the next day, so resources were completely shifted to what was happening there. And so we're sort of very much on our own and trying to figure out just how to get back. There was obviously no commercial flights. The road wasn't safe at that point to make a road journey, which is about 12 hours, which I did do later. But at that point, things were very unknown and very chaotic. And Mazar is it's about an hour and a half from the Uzbekistan border. So we just really had to come to the conclusion that the only way to get out was to talk to the Taliban. And so it sort of took a few days, and we were running out of food at that point in the hotel. And I really just felt bad because you had these staff, these wonderful people that were staying for us really and staying to kind of take care of us. And the Taliban was just constantly trying to get in downstairs. And again, we just didn't know how they were going to respond. And so you had them trying to get in all the time. And we just knew that however we did it, we had to get out. And that seemed to be really the most logical thing to do.
so when you say we, what was the group that you were?
Just my photographer and I.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so when you say the Taliban was trying to get in, I mean, I'm assuming if they wanted to get in there, like the hotel staff isn't going to physically be able to keep them.
Right. So we had a couple of guards that used to, because the hotel, there was a bank underneath the hotel. So they had a couple of guards at the front. And so immediately that night that the Taliban took over, they used to wear camouflage and they got rid of their guns. They hid their guns away and then, just changed into Afghan dress. And just, every day we'd go down and they would say, the Taliban's came back again last night and they tried to get in, and it wasn't clear whether they were trying to get into the bank, whether they were trying to get into the hotel. It wasn't clear, but the guards were sort of able to convince them to go away and say nobody's here. And then at one point, the manager of the hotel, or the owner, one of the staff members put him on the phone to me and he said, I talked to the Taliban, they've promised not to enter the hotel. Not that they sort of agreed to that, but it gave me some sort of level of like, okay, I think I'll be okay for another few hours.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess it was very unknown. And then, in the end, when I was talking to somebody in the State Department in Kabul, and I just said to him, I said, I think I'm just going to go talk to the Taliban. And to my surprise, he didn't argue. He went, it's a possibility you could do that. And I think at that point, because the US had dialogue in Doha with the Taliban, it wasn't as completely outlandish as it sort of sounds.
Yeah. So how did you go about?
So it kind of happened really quickly. So we were like, do we go back to Kabul? Do we take this risk and do this drive? Do we hire a driver? Do we go to Uzbekistan? And then I had some help, which it kind of didn't unfold until afterwards, and I really sort of put the picture together. But one of the U.S. diplomats had helped me get in contact with the Uzbek consulate, which was closed in Mazar, but they were willing to kind of help us get to the border, which was closed. So a local business person just called and said, I need you to be in the hotel lobby, ready to go in half an hour. And so he was sort of our middle person, and he was able to arrange for the Taliban elders to come to the hotel to pick us up. So it was very quickly, and so we just sort of packed our stuff up, and I wasn't really even sure what was happening. And then I go into the parking lot downstairs, and the Taliban elders are there, and
how did that
getting into their car.
Yeah. What was like a car or a van or what?
Yeah, it was just a Toyota Corolla. just what everybody has in Afghanistan, a Toyota Corolla.
So you jump in, and then what?
So I jump in, and and the Taliban are like, welcome. And one of them was the cousin of the governor, who shadow governor for a long time, suddenly the governor. And he says, the governor welcomes you and wishes he could be here, but he's a bit busy today. And I'm thinking to myself, this is so bizarre. But I was very transparent. I said, I'm a journalist. Can I interview you? So we're driving around Mazar, and they said, sure. So I'm asking them, what about their interpretation of Islamic law, and they're telling me about cutting people's hands off and stoning people for infidelity, and if you murder someone, you should, if it's intentional, you're going to get hung, and they're saying this all with a big smile on their face, and then at the same time telling me, you're welcome to stay, and it was this very fascinating contrast of what was happening. And then we went to the Uzbek consulate, and they were lovely, and they said, we'll drive you to the border. So we went, and then we had a Taliban escort to the border because we had to be able to get through the checkpoints without problems. So we had this sort of young Taliban group that took us, and again, that was, you had the complete opposite. So you had these guys that had just acquired their American weapons and were taking selfies at the same time. And it was very bizarre experience. Yeah. And
What were you wearing?
I was just wearing a hijab, and I wore a mask.
Okay. And was that kind of a dictated thing, or you just knew that?
I had a burqa, but I refused to wear it. It wasn't you always wear a hijab in Afghanistan, but I refused to wear anything that was beyond that because, again, it wasn't necessary, I didn't think, and nothing was really said to me.
Yeah. You mentioned you wore a mask, like a COVID mask kind of mask?
Yeah, I wore a mask. Yeah. Just because I felt at first, in certain situations I wore a mask, not that often, but I wore them sometimes because I think it made people open up to me a little bit more when I was interviewing Taliban. They felt a little bit more comfortable when I had a mask on and they could just only see my eyes. I tried to avoid wearing it as much as possible, but if I felt that it was going to be beneficial to the interview, I did that.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I think, element to the reason why they require women to wear face coverings and kind of the weird, not to get too far off on a tangent, but the kind of the weird transition that our country has gone through that way, where people have gotten so used to it to where now they almost feel uncomfortable without it in some cases. But, or even in your cases that, they feel more comfortable talking to you without it. There's a weird...
And not because of COVID. There's no COVID in Afghanistan, but because of just...
Yeah, I have that written down
the distraction.
But there's a strange dynamic to that you see, I think, kind of creeping into our society with some of this mass stuff, which is alarming to me. But that is one of the questions I actually had was, is COVID even something that people mention? Like, is there there's not? I
think initially they had a bit of back in sort of the spring of 2020 when we all were dealing with the beginning of COVID, they had a number of deaths and things. But after that, it was, it's not talked about. You don't. Strangely enough, you do see Taliban wearing, pretty much they're the only ones. You'll see a bunch of them riding around in their cars wearing the masks.
Really?
Whereas in normal, I don't think it's anything to do with COVID. I think they just, they think they look tough or something with a mask on. I really don't think.
With a baby blue mask on?
Yeah, so I think that was a bizarre thing. But there was sort of a running joke where sort of someone had said to one of the Haqqanis, even COVID ran away from you.
Yeah.
Because there isn't COVID there. And I could argue, I think people in Afghanistan have very strong immune systems. I think you're exposed to a lot when you're there. It's an open sewage system. So therefore, you're going to, be exposed to, you have to build up that immune system pretty quickly. Yeah. You don't see overweight people too much in Afghanistan. Certainly, it's a different diet and lifestyle. And I really don't think Afghans have been afflicted by COVID the way other countries have.
Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic that way, and that how much of it is allowing it to impact your society versus how much it actually does. We could spend a whole episode on that. I won't take any more of that, the time of...
And they just have bigger things to worry about.
Yeah. Well, and so same thing with like a lot of the other social issues that you see here that aren't issues there because they have way more important shit to worry about. And I think I've talked about this. I mean, I don't know how many times on different episodes with different guests, but you know, I do think we're a victim of our own success that way, and that we've been so sheltered, comfortable, and successful for so long that now human beings, there's an element of being meant to struggle and to need something to persevere over, to give yourself purpose, is that we have invented things to make us feel that way. Which
yeah, I agree. I think people often lead fairly meaningless lives, and people are always looking for some sort of deeper meaning in their life. So therefore, problems that don't really exist are created and blown up into these big things because people are looking for that struggle, that meaning, that purpose of something. And often when I tell Afghans about some of the issues that are very prevalent in the United States, it's very confusing for them. What are you talking about? How is this a problem? And
I can imagine. All right, so once you got driving around with these guys and you're interviewing and things of that nature, did that open any other doors in terms of where you could go or where you did go, or what happened?
So what happened was we went to, so initially everything was sort of happening in Kabul. We went to the Uzbek border. We stayed there for a little while, and then I kind of wanted to let the chaos that was happening in Kabul die down a little bit. I had some work to do in Dushanbe and Tajikistan as well. So I went there and then drove back to the Uzbekistan border and decided that, the day that Americans were leaving for the last time, that I was going to drive back. So I literally walked over the bridge back into Afghanistan, and we hired a driver to drive us from Haratan, which is the border town, back down to Kabul, which is a really heinous 12-hour drive. But I wanted to do that, and it sounds crazy to be always trying to get back into a country that everyone else is trying to leave, but I felt that it was an important part of history, and that it was important to be there and to witness it and to not leave.
Yeah. What does a road trip like that, I mean, what is that like? I mean, you're not stopping at 7-Eleven and grabbing snacks before you get on the road, right?
Yeah, and again, that time of the year too was so hot. We were sort of all shoved into, again, Toyota Corolla. There was a bunch of us in there, and we drove all the way through, and you got a really great view of Afghanistan and some of the smaller areas, and it was really fascinating. You see the corruption when you get to something like the Solang Pass, which is a very strategic road. A couple of hours sort of north of Kabul, and it's just being the amount of money that's spent on a project like that. But then what happens is somebody gets the contract who then subcontracts, who then someone else uses cheap materials, and then it's never finished and it's never fixed. And the trucks, which are always incredibly overloaded, they immediately just erode and you think, we paid hundreds of millions of dollars for this road as US taxpayers, and look at it.
Yeah.
And, you're crawling through it. So you look at Google Maps and it should be a journey that takes 6 or 7 hours, but in reality it's going to take double that because of the situation.
Yeah. From a transportation standpoint, obviously the roads are hit and miss, but what about like gas stations and cell coverage and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's spotty, but you can get that in when you get to bigger towns. I didn't have, what I would do is usually just connect to someone else's hotspot because my international data plan, for probably a number of reasons, didn't cover Afghanistan. But usually we just, we have like a hotspot. So I had a burner phone, and I just set up a hotspot on that burner phone with a local SIM card so that I was able to be connected all the time.
You have any luck with either sat phones or sat hotspots using that technology?
I mean, we have them, but because of the cost, I only have them for an emergency situation if I really needed it. So other than that, once you get these hotspots set up, which are pretty common there, it's easy to kind of use.
Black market wise, while you're there, especially when the Taliban takes back over, is there an element of guys running around selling shit they're not supposed to, or like is a lot of business?
There's always been an element of that in Afghanistan. Obviously, it's always been a big market for that. And you go to the grocery store and it's just all this shit stolen from the base. Like there's the Black Rifle coffee, there's the, just everything you can find. It's just everything classic. Was stolen from. And this is the regular grocery store. And then you have special sort of stores that are set up, military stores that are set up. They're obviously really popular, during when, and not just for military people, but contractors and all embassy security. Everybody would go there to get their stuff, and you could buy things really cheap. So they sort of still there, but again, it was just everything stolen from bases. And there's actually a place was called Bush Bazaar, named after George W. Bush, and it's this big bazaar. The Taliban renamed it the Mujahideen Bazaar, but it's just everything you can imagine stolen from every base. You've got just expired food, supplements, anything, and it was kind of funny. You had one guy that was working there, and he was like a bodybuilder, and he was selling supplements that were clearly stolen. And the Taliban walks into the store, and he's telling the Taliban, "You're too skinny. You need to come to my gym and work out." And then the guys are, "Oh, okay." And then he says he does this every day. He says, "Oh, I saw somebody suspicious around the corner. You better go get them." The Taliban says, "Where?" And then they get their guns and start running, and I look, and he says, "Oh, we do this every day." So I think some people certainly have a sense of humor. But yeah, that stuff is everywhere. You have also at some of these places, and a lot of the guys, because they hate the Taliban, hid a lot of their great stuff behind the counter. Otherwise, the Taliban, who doesn't know the value of something, will just come in and say, "I want this thermal scope." But yeah, you could, if you wanted to, you can go and buy something like a scope that would be worth thousands of dollars for a couple of $100.
Really?
Yeah.
Are in that same vein, are drugs and illicit things like that also pretty prevalent in that same vein?
I mean, Afghanistan exports more than 90% of the world's heroin, really. So the poppy fields and the opium and everything are very much still running, even though the Taliban says we're going to outlaw it, it's haram. It's money for them. Yeah. So I think the way that they view it is, if you're selling it overseas, it's okay, just don't sell it to Afghans.
Oh, okay. Is heroin an issue for Afghan? A lot of them are on it. Really?
It's got huge addiction problems. And what the Taliban was doing was they were taking a lot of people off the streets and putting them in jail. So I went to a jail in Kandahar where they put a lot of the addicts that were there, I guess, because they don't have formal detox facilities. So they just put them in this jail to I guess, detox. And, it was sad. There were kids, boys as young as 13 that were there, and you see these cycles that happen through families. So the father might be addicted and then sends his son out to pick up the drugs for him, and then the son gets addicted, and it's a big problem. It's a vicious cycle.
Would you say percentage-wise per capita it's on the level that it is here, or less or more? Or?
I would say it is here at least, if not more.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it stands to reason if it's coming from there, it's probably cheap and as readily available as the most of anywhere on the planet. But I guess I just would have assumed with the stigma attached to it, with how strict they are on so many things, that maybe it wouldn't be as big of a problem. But
I think it, again, especially in those poorer societies, it has become a big problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, so you make your 12-hour journey down towards Kabul. Do you make it back to Kabul at that point?
Yeah, we do. We do that night. Yeah. We get in and
so what happened then?
We go back to the house where we'd left all our stuff. So, when I'd left to go to Mazar, because I only thought that I would be there for a few days, I had left all my stuff in Kabul. So, yeah, we're able to go back. And I remember going out that next morning to the grocery store, and the Taliban is on every sort of street corner, and this fruit seller is just like, "What are you doing? Aren't you scared?" And we're sort of like, "Not really." I felt fairly confident that it was going to be okay. Even though everybody had left, I felt confident it would be okay. I still had a few British friends of mine that had stayed. And so, yeah, I guess I wasn't as alarmed as the media perhaps wanted me to be or portrayed it as.
Yeah. Were there times where you were legitimately frightened for your life while you were there?
I wouldn't say frightened for my life. There were certainly situations where I felt very uncomfortable. I think one particular assignment that I did was going into Chapagar, which is an area in Nangarhar. It's just outside of Jalalabad. That's the ISIS area. It's ISIS controlled. So that was certainly an uncomfortable experience, something I felt was important to do, to go into that territory to understand exactly what was happening, because that's really where they plan a lot of their operations. Things like what happened at the airport where the 13 American servicemen and women were killed, as well as 180 Afghans. That's sort of the base of operations for ISIS in Afghanistan, and I felt that it was important to sort of get a better understanding of what was happening. So that was uncomfortable. I got detained once in Spin Boldak, which is in Kandahar. It's sort of the crossing into Quetta in Pakistan, and that wasn't the most pleasant experience either, but I think...
Why were you detained?
I didn't even know, really. So we were doing interviews, and I just got mobbed. So everywhere I went, it's just hundreds of people that would they just surround you, and they see a foreigner, they see a camera, and that obviously attracted the attention of the Taliban, who were riding around, and then we were kind of there, and the Taliban was like, get into the police vehicle, and I said, no, my driver's coming. My driver, Shafiq, we couldn't get hold of him. He'd gone off to eat. He's always eating. So we couldn't get hold of Shafiq, and so I was with Naweed, my fixer, and a fixer is somebody we as journalists always have in places. They kind of locals that help facilitate interviews, often interpret, and they're just, I guess, like producers, really. And so we were trying to get hold of Shafiq. He wasn't picking up the phone. He wasn't where he dropped us off. And so the Taliban basically just forced me into their police vehicle and took us to the police station, and we got detained there, and they accused us of being spies, which is unfortunately a tag that journalists get accused of a lot. Even when I gave them all my paperwork, I had a letter from Zabihullah Mujahid, who's the Taliban spokesperson, and when you arrive back in the country, you have to go to the ministry and get a specific letter from the Taliban that basically you just wave at checkpoints that allows you to go through, and it just verifies that you're a press person.
How would a checkpoint verify the authenticity of that?
Oh, that's also another struggle, because a lot of them can't read. Yeah. They can't read the letter. It's in Pashto, and they can't read it. So most of the time, being a woman really helps, because they don't want to question a woman. They just say go, go, go. But yeah, it's there were a few situations we'd sort of get in arguments with them, but most of the time they were fairly accepting of it. I think initially they just had never seen it and didn't know, but I think they probably got a lot more used to it as time went on. So we were detained for a while there. Even when I was giving them my passports, my press cards, the letter, they just said, this is all fake. I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm showing you my credentials. It's not fake. So it took a bit of time for them to be able to kind of verify everything, and just an unpleasant experience.
Then at that point, they let you go after a few hours?
They did let us go afterwards, and they were very apologetic, and they said, they'd give us special access to that border area and take us to that place. So I was lucky, because I certainly, unfortunately, I have friends there now that just after I left, were, I can't say too much about it, but are arrested, and we are unable to locate them at this point. So,
oh, really?
Westerners. So, I think that's also part of the reason I knew the right timing to get out. But yeah, it can really just happen to anyone. And when you're accused of that, it's hard to have any other leverage to
so these are actual colleagues of yours that are missing there right now? Yeah,
well, they're good friends of ours that we spent a lot of time with there, and extremely versed in Afghanistan. One of them is just, he's been living on and off there since the Soviet days, and he's really my go-to for any Afghan questions. Like, what about this? What about this history? Just knows everything about it inside out, back to front, and I'm not even really clear what happened. Because they seemed to, things were going fine they were on a research project, and it was all fine. I saw them the night before I left, and then I kind of got a call a week later to say that they'd been arrested, and at this point, we haven't even been able to kind of locate which facility that they're even in. So
they've been MIA for close to a month.
Yeah. So it's a worry.
Yeah, it's pretty dicey.
Yeah.
All right. So when you get back to Kabul and you go up into, did you go up into that ISIS region shortly after that?
No, that was not something I did. I actually interviewed some ISIS members in Kunar province. That I did that. That mean about a month into it, I think, a month into being back, and then to go into the actual ISIS area, I didn't do that until a couple of weeks before I left.
Okay.
So that was in November.
Do they use the K designation, or is that something that
they use the K designation, but they don't really call themselves anything. It's really just Daesh.
Yeah.
Which is a derogatory term, just a general term. But the Taliban refuses to basically even acknowledge that the Daesh exists. They want to pretend that they have this complete, best security ever, and so they don't even like the idea of you mentioning the Daesh or ISIS, and they'll always tell me, don't do any stories on ISIS. I'm like, you're not going to tell me what stories I can do. But they're very concerned about their reputation and wanting to be seen as the peacekeepers. But it's a problem. It's a big problem.
Do you know ballpark how many numbers of ISIS guys are?
Previous estimates, I think, have been about 2,000 to 3,000, and that was around 2017. And then 2019, the Afghan government came out and said that the Daesh was defeated in Afghanistan. Subjective, but I think at that point it was reduced to just a couple of hundred. But since the withdrawal and they've all been let out of jail, that's also the problem, is that, and the ones that I interviewed, they're all in Bagram and they'd suddenly been released from jail just during that chaotic withdrawal. I think in some cases the Taliban may have extended that general amnesty to them. In other cases, just they were able to escape because of that. The Afghan guards had left, and before that, the vacuum came in where the Taliban came in. There was that period where they were able to kind of just walk out. So now you're dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, more ISIS-K fighters who have been in prison for the last few years, who are now back into the fold, and it's a big problem. I mean, when I was there, it was almost daily attacks that were happening.
Do you know why the I guess the break off from the Taliban? I mean, I think to most of us, we would look at them. It's kind of like you guys seem like you're largely on the same side. What do you have to fight about, type of thing? And
they have very different ideologies. The Taliban is very Afghan centric. It doesn't have any great desire to extend its law or its rule beyond Afghanistan's borders. It very much sees, it just wants to see Afghanistan as an Islamic state, and it doesn't really particularly care what happens in other places. Whereas ISIS obviously has a much more global ideology, much more, say, like Al Qaeda, which it wants to see this global caliphate, and it doesn't sort of recognize these borders. Yeah. So they do have a very different mentality, I guess, in that way. I think for a lot of them, they joined because they didn't see the Taliban as extreme enough. So one of them that I interviewed said to me, they wrote in the media that the Taliban controls 80% of the country. This was prior to the fall, which we all read, supposedly the Taliban is controlling a large part of the country. And he said, well, why weren't they implementing Sharia law in these places? Why weren't they weren't cutting off enough hands? They weren't stoning enough people. They weren't hanging enough people, and supposedly they control all these areas and they weren't doing enough. So I think a lot of them were just motivated because they wanted even more a sort of extremity than what was happening, and were very determined that they wanted to live like the Prophet, in the era of the Prophet, and they felt that the Taliban were not doing enough to support that viewpoint.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I would think, or maybe it's because of the difficulties that they had in Iraq and Syria once Trump came into office and really kind of swept through there. Is there an understanding that they kind of fled to Afghanistan as?
I think there is a cadre of foreign fighters from different places. I don't think it's super huge, but I certainly think that they do have some foreign fighters that left for there. But majority are Afghans, and again, the ISIS was was formed out of, it was really a Taliban leader that, as it always seems to be in this part of the world, it's a Taliban leader who got in a fight with another Taliban leader, and then he's the one who sort of went off in 2015 and pledged allegiance to Baghdadi and formed the affiliate in Afghanistan. The Taliban itself is a break-off, of the Mujahideen. So it's just everything there. It becomes this power struggle that prompts somebody to go and start something else, and that is probably my biggest concern for Afghanistan now is, even within the Taliban, the amount of infighting. At what point does that mean someone else is going to break off and start something else?
Yeah, I guess that is the one thing maybe we take for granted here. Even with as much as we argue and not get along, there's still a method to the madness to a certain extent, government structure-wise and order-wise. But so were you in Kabul during the period of the crazy mass evacuations?
No, I was in the North Bend.
Okay.
So yeah,
so you didn't really get a feel for what it was like?
Not really, other than, I didn't think at that point to get back to Kabul, it wouldn't have served me at that point as much as, I would have been very fascinated to sort of see that. Yeah. But I think at that point it was better for me to wait and to go back in when that was done.
Were you able to, from a communication standpoint, have a good idea of what was going on? Like,
Absolutely. I was in super regular contact with people that was sort of trying to get through there every day. And it was honestly, it was madness. And when I see the people who had SIV visas could just never get to the gate. They could never get to the gate to get out, even though they had the paperwork. And it wasn't even that they were being stopped. It was just they physically could not get there, or they were being turned away, and I question the rhyme or reason. I know people that got on those evacuation flights that are now in the United States, that were on United States ban lists, and not for any egregious sort of security issue, but because they did, graffiti and things like that to U.S. kind of buildings. But they never served. They never supported the United States in that capacity. And so I question, well, how is it that these particular people were able to get safe passage out when there are many people who really did, support the U.S. war effort there, who have a very genuine need to leave, who just simply still can't leave. So I think there was really no rhyme or reason to a lot of it as it was happening. It just became this complete kind of, it was very much a lucky draw if you were able to get in. Yeah. And if you were able to be that person to sort of push your way to the front and get on those planes, it's also questionable. And again, you go back to the thought of, why were there so many military-age men on those planes? Where were the women and children who are often the ones who are going to suffer the most from what's happening? And you can't help but question, if so many of these military-age men are leaving, is there, if there is ever a resistance, or if there is ever an opportunity to take back that palace, who's going to be left to do it?
No, I agree. I found myself, thinking that same thing and seeing a lot of these flight, videos of the evacuations. I am curious. Do you have an understanding of what the process was, vetting wise, that was being used at those airports when Afghanis were being evacuated? I
don't think there was a huge rhyme or reason to it. I can't imagine how they were able to do any adequate vetting. I think a couple of months earlier, the embassies had tried to kind of open a system, but it's very difficult there. I mean, people have the difficult naming system. It's difficult, just people don't have documents. People don't have all these sort of IDs. And so I don't really know how you're supposed to vet people properly.
Yeah.
I don't know how you physically do that. And certainly a lot of people I know who'd left didn't qualify for anything. So either you were using fake documents or nobody really asked you for it.
Yeah. What do you think should be done with because it's at this point, I think it's a couple 100,000 people that have been evacuated, and a number of which are here. What are your thoughts on what we as a country should do with the evacuees that are here now?
I mean, you're here now, and I always support people that I think it's a very difficult thing to leave a country. I think sometimes we don't always sort of see that side of it, and so I think as Americans, we want them to be to make a positive contribution to our country and to support our way of life in that way, and be able to be a positive part in society. I think it's always a challenge when you're a refugee. And one of the arguments the Taliban uses, especially in the beginning, when people said, well, why are you blocking all these people from leaving? And Sohail Shaheen, I remember him saying, because when they go to these other countries, you have doctors, you have teachers, you have lawyers, they're going to become cab drivers. They're going to work in a grocery store. And yet here they are with the ability to be, very positive people in society. And so his argument was, well, we need these people in Afghanistan. Yeah. We don't need them driving an Uber in another country. I think that's always just a challenge when you are a refugee. And I think a lot of people in the heat, the Afghans in the heat of the moment, who just wanted to leave, I kept warning them, even friends of mine that were trying to leave, I said, you're going to get to this other country and it's not going to be easy. It's not easy coming to the United States. Nobody's going to be there, with 1,000 handouts for you. It's hard, and you're leaving a life behind. So just really think about that decision before you make it. Think about, I know it's tough right now, but what I found is people want to leave not necessarily because of the Taliban. I'm sure it is a factor, but it's the economy, it's the humanitarian situation. Yeah. So that is the driver for people wanting to leave, not necessarily because of the security situation.
Sure. Would a Madam President McKay give them U.S. citizenship and just let them?
I think it really depends on the individual. Again, I never see anything good coming out of mass migration, and any of the conflicts I've ever covered in my life, I just never see anything hugely positive. I think certainly migration, as an immigrant myself, I think migration is incredibly important to any society, but in mass numbers, I don't think it, it always serves them well. But certainly if their life is in extreme risk, we have an obligation in that way. But I think whatever can be done for people to be able to stay in their homes, that is most important. And I want to see, again, if we can address some of the economic, the humanitarian concerns, the employment concerns, things like that are all happening in Afghanistan. That is why people are trying to leave. I think if we can address or play some sort of positive part in that, and having people stay in their homes, I always think that is going to be a better long-term outcome than just hundreds, if not millions of people fleeing. And Afghanistan does need good people to stay there. It needs doctors, it needs lawyers, and the Taliban needs to allow women to work and to go to school and to be functioning people in society. And so they have a lot to learn in that respect. But whatever we can do for people to live safely in their homes is, to me, always going to be a better option. Yeah,
no, I agree. Did you see a big shift specifically as it relates to women in that avenue of, okay, now you can't do this, you can't,
and it did. It was unfortunate because one of the first things the Taliban did was they shut down the public schools for high school and in some cases the universities. Most of these places were gender segregated anyway. One of the things they mandated was that had to be strict separation between men and women. A lot of the times that happened anyway, so it wasn't that big of a shift. The private schools were still running or are still running, same with the universities, but the Taliban shut down the public system for girls and then they sort of opened it up in a couple of provinces and then closed it again. So that's been a really, really concerning shame because now we're going on 4 or 5 months where girls have missed this critical part of their education. And the Taliban keeps saying, whenever you bring it up, they keep saying, we support girls' education, but we want to make sure that it follows Islamic law, not sort of this Western influence. They keep using the same excuse. So it's very unclear to me why they're continuing with that. And then in addition to that, I think a lot of the women who were in the workforce, were either unable to go to their jobs, or there was also a lot of just self-censorship happening where people were suddenly too scared to go out, or their jobs didn't exist anymore. And so you sort of saw a lot of the women that were in the workforce previously that were suddenly at home.
Yeah. So as a hypothetical, an 18-year-old Afghan woman who basically her entire life up until a few months ago, let's say in Kabul or in a major city, is her life now compared to 6 months ago 180-degree difference?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's really, to me, that's the saddest part of the whole transition. And that was something, you know, I brought up on so many occasions, was just like, if you had some, you know, if you allow women to be part of society, it would make a really big difference. And not only within Afghanistan, but on the world stage. And this is one of the big reasons why people loathe you is because of this. And so their lives, you know, girls, women are really the ones who do suffer. So people that, especially women that were in sports, you know, and that was a really big thing over the 20 years. Suddenly sports are very much opened up to women. You had Afghans competing in taekwondo and football and just all these things, and then suddenly that was immediately taken from them because the Taliban does not agree with women playing sport. And so, you know,
do they feel the same way about just exercising in general? Like,
it's fine for men. You know, they're
women,
very,
though.
yeah. It's not really a cultural thing. I mean, there are gyms that have certain hours that women can go to, but yeah, I guess it's not a huge part of the culture. I don't hear too many women talking about it. They have women's parks, so sometimes in the mornings you used to see women walking around parks. But you know, the Taliban also took a lot of those over as well and made life a little bit more difficult. But yeah, it's just one thing they can't wrap their heads around.
Yeah.
It's confusing to them.
Wow. All right. So the remainder of your time there, once you got back down to Kabul and kind of the rest of your time there, can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So we got back to Kabul, and that was in the very beginning of September, and it was really the first time that we were able to see Afghanistan, because a lot of the provinces that had previously, it was just very difficult to get around because of the level of danger, and because the Taliban controlled so many of the roads, and if they didn't control the roads, then they were constantly under fire. So you couldn't really drive to a lot of places by car. So suddenly, because a lot of that threat had been eliminated, because the Taliban was in control, that's sort of, I made it really a point to go to as many of these areas as possible, whether that was Kandahar, which I love that place, but it's it's sort of, I guess, it's sort of where the Taliban was founded, when Mullah Omar founded the Taliban, and it's a beautiful province, and Kandaharis are very lovely, sort of fun-loving people. So I made it a point of going to places like that, to Bamiyan, which is just stunning, and it's where the Taliban blew up the Buddhas in 2001, and then you had places like Herat. And one of the most remote places is Nuristan. So I really wanted to go there, and we sort of went through Kunar and Korangal and those places there. So it was just fascinating being able to see so many areas and talk to people from so many different walks of life with such different sort of views on what was happening. And also each province, you have a very different type of Taliban as well. Some of them are a lot more sort of Salafist, or some of them are a lot more lenient, I guess, in other places. A lot of them are much more kind of terrifying. So you sort of get this very different dynamic. And also in that beginning phase, we sort of smuggled our way into Panjshir as well, because that was really the last resistance point, where there was still a force that were fighting against the Taliban. And that was really a prized province, because that was the only place that the Taliban were never able to control, even in their last reign. That was the one province that always held out. So there was so much back and forth on the internet about, has it fallen, has it not fallen, who was controlling it? And it was very hard to get an accurate picture. And so we sort of were able to kind of smuggle our way back in early September, and to, I guess, try to understand exactly what was happening and who was controlling.
Yeah. So a lot of these places were places you'd never been, or they were,
Yeah, a lot of the provinces were places I'd never been. Yeah.
did traveling to all these different places, many of which you've not been to, did that change your overall opinion and perspective on both Afghanistan, the Taliban, and where it's at, where it's headed?
I think it's so easy to forget just what a beautiful country Afghanistan is. I think so much we just tend to focus on the bloodshed that happens there, and we forget it's one of the most aesthetically stunning, naturally stunning places that I think I've ever been to. It's just there's so many breathtaking parts of it, and so I like to be able to highlight that too, because I think that is really important to showcase that side of it. I wouldn't say it changed my perspective necessarily, but it's certainly a privilege to be able to go to these places. As a foreigner, I feel very fortunate. I don't know that a lot of Afghans themselves would feel safe or necessarily even be able to do that. I think the Taliban certainly gives a little bit more leniency to a foreigner than it does to the Afghan people. Similarly, as a journalist, as a foreign journalist, they're not really going to tell me what to do, whereas they will tell an Afghan journalist or arrest an Afghan journalist if they do something they don't like. Whereas a foreigner is treated as a guest in their country, and Afghan culture with Pashtunwali is very adamant about that's a top priority, is to treat a guest well. So one of the ironic things really is that I was able to work and operate in Afghanistan relatively safely, because of that code, because I was considered to be a guest and someone that was authorized to be there, and I hadn't snuck in or anything like that. I'd had a proper visa that was issued under the previous government, but they still honored it. And so I was a guest in their country, and sort of ironically enough, you can compare that to that's the way they viewed Osama bin Laden back in the 90s. They viewed him as an authorized guest in their country, and that was going to be their top priority. So when September 11 happened and George W. Bush said, hand him over or we're coming in, and they said, we're not going to hand over our guest. He's the only one giving us money. And so, henceforth, a war was started. But it's this sort of a moral code that they take very seriously.
Yeah, it's fascinating for sure. The kind of the ironies that are all woven, in with that. But on the one hand, you've got a female, a foreigner, which under any other circumstance, they're probably going to put you at the bottom of the totem pole, but because you're essentially a mouthpiece for another country and that bridge or liaison, information and communication wise, they want to protect that and put themselves in the best light possible, which it's just an interesting dynamic.
And they're very scared of interacting with women.
Yeah.
It's very new to them. They've just never. It's a very new interaction for them. It's so far removed from their culture to have a woman, especially working with men, and just to sort of be in the streets. They don't know how to respond, and so they're sort of taught as a sign of respect. Often for most parts, is they won't look at you. They'll look at the ground because they just don't know what else to do. And I found that by the end, they were looking at me a lot more. And that was because I sort of, made a point to kind of just stare at them until they looked at me. But yeah, so I did see that. I did see a big change from the beginning when they literally would not, they were upset about even having to interview with me. And when they did interview with me, it was always looking at the ground. Yeah. And then by the end of it, I would say majority of them were actually, when I walked into a room, would actually nod and say hello, whereas this didn't happen at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's so weird to be ignored for like a complete month straight, though. It was like I found myself getting really irritated when I would go home. I'd be like, what is wrong with me? I was like, oh, because you've been invisible for the last month. Yeah.
It was like the parent of a teenager, right? Yeah. Where was the point at which you said, okay, now it's time to leave? Was there a shift or a distinct thing that happened that made you say
I did have an obligation that I'd put off of several obligations. I did have an obligation in December that I needed to be back for New York. So that was sort of a marker for me of, okay, it's time to go. But I did, up until that point, definitely start to feel things were getting a lot more authoritarian. The bizarre thing with the Taliban was that, especially for that first month after they took power, it was, you could walk into a ministry, you could walk into the, and there was barely, I would never get checked at security. You didn't have to go through super layers of permission the way that you had to previously to get an interview. You had to write letters and do this and get permission, whereas the Taliban were just, I literally walked up to a suicide bombing school and knocked on the gate and said, hi, I'd like to come in. And they let me in. So it was this weird sort of freedom at first.
If there was a doorbell, would you have pushed
it was in a kindergarten. They'd taken over a kindergarten
and
to train their suicide bombers.
Yeah. I'd be hesitant to knock.
So I literally, we're knocking, I'm walking in and there's stuffed toys in the front. I was like, this is just creepy.
Wow. Were you there to interview?
Yeah.
Did you get the interview?
Yeah.
Really?
They were very hospitable
Really?
about us coming in, and it was a special command. It was called the Badri Command, and they trained their suicide bombers at this kindergarten. And that's one thing that the Taliban is very adamant that they're not getting rid of, even though they are a government now. They're still very bent on having these trained, ready to go suicide bombers.
So in terms of interviewing them to try to, force their hand from a justification standpoint, what was their response?
They just see it as they've got, that to them, suicide bombing was or is a tactic that they use because they did not have, say, during the insurgency, they did not have access to air power and to the things that the U.S. military has. So to them, suicide bombing was that equivalent tactic of being able to
level the
playing field a lot, because they knew that obviously the U.S. or the Afghan forces were not going to have that. So that was their tactic, and they see it as this very esteemed thing. It's literally the highest level of respect you can earn is to be a suicide bomber. Their supreme leader, Hibatullah, one of his sons was a suicide bomber, and that's just why the Taliban reveres him, because they see, he gave up his son, and they see it as this. The Haqqanis did a big festival while we were there celebrating suicide bombers and offering the families money and land, because there's no higher thing to do to them than to be a suicide bomber. And they have these kids that are just begging. They're begging to be suicide bombers.
Wow. So I'm assuming then, not just with him, but with any family where a suicide bomber comes from that family, it's like a status thing. And
hugely status. So you can be from a very poor family, and most often the suicide bombers are. And so this family can be, hugely elevated in society in their villages because one of their sons was a suicide bomber. Yeah. So it's
all right. So going back to the decision to leave.
Decision to leave. So I did start to notice. So you had this first month of sort of strange freedom, and then you started to just notice things were becoming. There was a much more of an authoritarian crackdown that was happening, and suddenly the access became a lot more difficult, and the Taliban were becoming just a lot more difficult to deal with. You started, even to themselves, like you go through checkpoints, and I would even see Taliban running a checkpoint. They would at least, thank goodness, but they were at least checking Talibans that were going through, and even the Talibans were being reprimanded for being told they needed to join either the police or the military. So they were trying to streamline things, but in streamlining things, you started to see this dictatorship kind of coming into play. And I had even one incident where I was at the restaurant that I was telling you I love, Herat. I was in the family section, and Talibans are not supposed to be going into any private homes or any private businesses or restaurants, and I was being harassed by these two Talibans who said they were intelligence, but refused to show me their ID, and then were badgering me for my ID and why I was there. And I just told them to F off, that I wasn't giving them anything. Jake my photographer was being much nicer to them, trying to explain, I'm a photojournalist and we're from here. And I just said, don't talk to them. They don't have permission to ask you that. So I filed a complaint on them, because I figured if you don't say something, they continue this sort of behavior of going around asking people and accusing people of being spies. And I found that was just happening more and more. You'd go through checkpoints and then suddenly the intelligence departments were stopping you and questioning you, and it just became a lot more uncomfortable. It became, there was always a sense of unease, and not just with the Taliban, but the level of ISIS attacks that were happening. You'd be sitting in a cafe and next thing you know, there's a bomb that just happened a block away, and it was just becoming so routine that you start to feel just that little bit of, okay, like it's a little bit on edge now. And so when, as much as I didn't want to leave, when the time came, I very much trust my instincts, and I think that's one of the things in my career that's always saved me is instinct, is knowing when to be in a situation and when not to be, and when the time to leave is. And I felt that my time was very much at that point was up. Obviously, I was writing a lot about the Taliban. I was writing a lot about ISIS, and being quite critical with that. And they have media departments that scour through, that speak very good English, that know exactly what you're doing and what you're saying and who you're speaking to. And I just felt that I was upsetting people, and that's part of my job. But part of my job is to know when to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever get the sense that you had pissed them off to the point where they were starting to take kind of offensive precaution measures of keeping you out of certain things? Or
I don't think it was specifically targeted at me trying to keep them out. I think it was just they would just suddenly become terrified of journalists and terrified of how they were being perceived. And I only really had one big problem with one Taliban official, and he was sort of someone who kind of runs this morality police, and we just had a disagreement. He tried to argue with me over an interview that he'd said that was recorded, and then tried to pretend he didn't say it, when I was like, I have the recording, you said it like multiple times. And he caused a lot of anxiety.
What was the comment that he was pissed about?
He was just upset. He'd been part of a shooting down of a U.S. aircraft, and then tried to say, no, it wasn't this aircraft, it was another aircraft. It was really pathetic, but he just created so much big deal about it and was threatening me, and I'm going to report you. And in the end, I just went, you know what, you can just cough, because I don't care at this point.
Yeah.
As soon as I stopped caring, it kind of went away. I think the more you play into it, the more it proliferates, and I'm sure he hates me. But I was like, it's your problem, not mine.
Yeah. That's funny. What was the process for actually leaving then?
So by that point, there were several commercial flights that were happening. I think one to Dubai, and I ended up taking a Cam Air flight to Abu Dhabi. So it was pretty easy for me. It wasn't anything different. By the time I'd gotten back to the airport, and a lot of the old airport staff were there, so they sort of knew how to run things. It was bizarre though. So the week before I left, I'd gone to Herat on a commercial flight, and mind you, it lands without any lights, no landing instruments. I was like, okay, I'm back, thank goodness. And I went to the military side of the airport because I wanted to go and see what had happened to all the equipment that was blown up by the US before they left. And so I go to request permission on the military side, and you're just looking at these guys and, with their Afghan dress and their beards and their turbans, and you're like, how are you running Kabul airport? Like, this is crazy. Yeah. And I said to the guy who's in charge of it, I said, how did you get this job? He said, oh, during the evacuation, I just walked in. And I said, okay.
Good.
This is comforting. Yeah. And I knew a pilot for one of the commercial airlines, and he said that the Taliban who's head of security said to him, which way is the exit?
Holy shit.
So I was like, this is not comforting. But in any case, I booked a flight. I had to get cash. I had to get a friend to get me cash from Dubai because they weren't taking any other cards, and very expensive flights. But it was really the best way to get out. And so I booked a commercial flight to get out, and so it was a chaotic airport situation, and then get on a plane and it's me and a bunch of Taliban on the plane. So they moved me to the front, to the family section. So I kind of had I think I was pretty much the only woman on the plane and had the entire section to myself. And and that was...
Any stewardesses on the plane?
No. Oh, they were? No, it was all men. Yeah, it was fun. They were very lovely. They kept coming up asking me, did I want more food? Did I want more meals?
What was the food on there? I'm curious.
Khmer actually has really good food.
Really?
It has really nice, good Afghan kebabs and bread and...
Any yogurt?
Oh, no, maybe not.
Yeah.
I might have had to make a special request for that. But yeah, the other airline that I flew to Herat was Ariana Airline, which is a little bit of a step down from Khmer. It's not quite as safe feeling, but
it all sounds pretty dicey to me. The level of courage I think that it would require to do what you do is pretty staggering. It's definitely an inspiration, no doubt about it. In the last little bit that you were there, or I guess once it fell. From once Kabul fell and it really felt like there was a shift, you saw a lot of reports here about China kind of jockeying for some roles in mining and things like that. Was there any evidence of that? Or did you
China already had a contract in Mazainak, which is in Logar province. It's just sitting on trillions of copper, and they got this lease deal in 2008, that they were able to sign that deal and beat out a lot of tenders from Canada and the US, but they never were able to really develop it. They did some exploration, but were never able to start the excavation because of the security situation, but they have a 30-year lease on it. And that's a gold mine, absolutely. If they're able to tap into that, you run the problem of, because Mazainak is also an incredible historian site. You've got really just old Buddhas dating back to the 4th, 5th centuries. You've got the Zoroastrian temples there. It's, and that is risky because you may lose a lot of that when you start to excavate. But back in 2001, we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have electric cars, so the value really for something like that wasn't there. But today, it's an absolute gold mine if China is able to begin that process, because they still have the lease on it. But you did see a lot of reports about China. Supposedly, the Taliban said we're going to rely on China for money and for aid. But I also heard toward the end of it that the Taliban had never received that money. Yeah. So they were angry at China at the same time, because China had said in the beginning, we're going to give you XYZ. And then I was hearing that the Taliban, that they hadn't sort of followed through that. So that was creating some problems with the Taliban. There were reports about China having taken over Bagram. I could never verify that, but Taliban was not letting anybody into Bagram. So either they just weren't letting people in, or there was something that they didn't want people to see in Bagram.
Yeah. One thing in thinking of China trying to go in there and mine things, especially in that area, I can't imagine that would go on for very long before, some excavators get drunk or grab a woman, or, something like that happens and it just turns into a total shitstorm.
It's possible, for sure. But part of the agreement was that China is supposed to build roads and bridges and all kinds of stuff around it.
But just knowing construction crews coming in and from a totally different culture that probably doesn't give a shit what, even if they get the brief going in, hey, don't do this, don't do that. It's no different than Americans in Okinawa or anybody anywhere that isn't from there, that, the type of people that do that kind of work, are usually blue collar folks that, are just like, whatever. And then it turns into this
terrible.
I just can't imagine that going well for very long.
And I think that's, what the Taliban is, they're very strict about, any country that wants to come in and do deals. And I said, are you open to U.S. contracting? And they said, we're open to any country, but they've got to follow our law. Yeah. They've got to follow our Islamic law. They can't bring in their own influence or their own way of doing
they're going to have booze and porn and everything else.
It's not going to fly.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so once you got back, kind of looking back on it, I'm curious, kind of three main questions, which is, from a big picture standpoint, again, Madam President, like what would you do? To having the perspective that you have, which I would argue is as well-rounded as probably anybody, and more well-rounded than almost everyone. I know that there's not a perfect solution, but what is your take on, if you were running the show, what you would do?
I think it's important to acknowledge that, and this again, it's not popular, it's not what people want to often hear, but the Taliban of today so far, and I stress so far, we don't know what happens down the road, so far is very different to the Taliban of the 90s. So far, they haven't implemented the morality police going around. They haven't started chopping off hands yet. They haven't done a lot of those very stringent things, and they say they're very determined to paint a different picture to what was kind of happening in the 90s, and they were obviously a very, very terrifying regime then, and certainly a terrifying regime now. But they have grown a lot in the 20 years. They've been exposed to social media. They've been exposed to a lot of different things, and are certainly trying to put forward. They're desperate for international recognition, and that was one thing they never got in their last reign. So now they're desperate for a seat at the UN. To them, that's the legitimization, and so they're sort of trying to do what they can to put their best foot forward. So I think in dealing with them, again, going back to what I said earlier about it would be tone deaf to completely isolate them, because I think that would be a national security threat. I think that we don't have to necessarily have diplomatic relations. We don't have to have, this positive relationship with them, but I think it's important to have a channel of communication where if things happen, or we can also use, the US is still the superpower who can use leverage, who can use its standing in the world to put pressure on the Taliban, to try to put them into line. I don't think we should be having dialogue with them that isn't about ensuring that that they are putting the interests of the Afghan people forward in a positive way. And I think really the most important thing now is to have that line of communication, to put pressure on them for some accountability, to really deal with the reality that is, not the reality we want. The Taliban is not going anywhere right now. There is no country that's going to come in and take them out. There is no resistance force that's strong enough to take them. And quite frankly, I think Afghans have had enough war for a little while. They've been at war for the past 30 years. So I think I don't want to see, any large-scale efforts to that will plunge that country back into war. The Taliban has proven how strong it is, and it would take a lot, I think, at this point for them to not be in power. So I think in dealing with that, we have to deal with the fact that they are in power and will be in power for some time. And to turn a blind eye isn't really the best solution. And so what we can do to sort of support Afghans themselves to be able to feed their families, to fill those basic necessities, that's what needs to happen.
Yeah. Just the aid piece still kind of on the fence as to how to even make that happen? Yeah,
I think there has to be a way of administering it, whether we have somebody like a Qatar or a middle country that is able to kind of go in and ensure accountability and ensure that distribution and ensure that it's not being taken by the Taliban, or that the money is not being used to fund the Taliban's military desires, that it is being. And I don't think Americans necessarily have to do that themselves. I think the reason we have relationships with a lot of these sort of more neutral countries, whether that be in Oman or a Qatar or a UAE or another country that can go in and ensure that accountability that we trust, that can ensure that somehow it's not squandered into corruption. I think that might be the best solution for now until. Or if America sort of ever feels that it can go back in itself, but that's always a slippery slope.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, absolutely. From your perspective, the American society as a whole, what is one of, or if there are a few, biggest misconceptions that we have about Afghanistan, especially right now?
I think you mean as America, just as a society? Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is that there is some sort of, genocide that's happening in Afghanistan under the Taliban, which just isn't accurate. It's not happening. There is certainly isolated cases, but it's just not. People are not being dragged from their home and shot en masse in the street.
So if you were to compare it to, say, Iraq and Syria at the height of ISIS, when you were in some of those areas, would you say that it's a fair representation that a lot of people think that that's how it is and it's not?
Yeah, I think people think that's how it is, and that's what's happening, and certainly cases get perpetuated, and a rumor will start and say, well, somebody was beheaded, and then a celebrity tweets that this person was beheaded, and suddenly everybody believes this person was beheaded, and it's like, but this never happened, or this poor person was murdered 12 months ago by a family fight, but she was never beheaded by the Taliban. But somehow these things get twisted and perpetuated, and I just think it doesn't do anybody a service to spin things that just aren't true. And for me, it's just about the fact. I don't have. It's important, I think, for journalists to not go in there with sort of agenda, or to go in there with already a preconceived idea of what they're going to say or write. I think it's really important. This is something we've lost, is just that ability just to go in there and look at what's happening and look at the fact, and whether whether it's something we want to hear or it's not, that doesn't matter. Yeah. We have to report the truth as we see it, and that always makes you a target for anyone who doesn't want to hear that. And that was one thing I really struggled with in Afghanistan, was you would report something as truthfully as possible, and the level of hate and arguments that I would get, no matter what side it was, that wanted to argue with me about it,
that are sitting over here now.
Yeah, and I was like, I don't understand why I'm even arguing with you about this, or why you refuse to believe that this is the situation, because it doesn't line up with the preconceived notion. And I found it to be really frustrating in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I mean, so it's fair to say that the time you spent in Iraq and Syria, from a civil rights or humanitarian standpoint, was far graver, would you say, than?
Obviously, the actions of ISIS, of the Daesh, are a lot more, just more barbaric. I mean, in those areas that I said that I went to that are controlled a lot by ISIS, I mean, it's just every day they'll dump heads in a sewage ditch, or
in Afghanistan even.
Yeah. So they will get Taliban fighters and they will behead them and hang them up from a tree with a ladder next to them, warning people, do not pick up these bodies. They're very, very barbaric. It's just the way they are. Whereas I don't find quite the same level of just barbarianism from the Taliban, as much as they do terrible things, and especially through the insurgency, we're really stone cold killers. But I think there's just a difference there. Yeah,
I suppose it stands to reason as a society, the Taliban has been kind of public enemy number one for 20 years, and so to think that all of a sudden that they're not, or that they're anything short of just being the worst humans on earth, is hard for people.
And it's hard. It's hard for me to wrap my head around them going from an insurgency to a government overnight. Yeah. And I said that to them too. I said, you can't expect, because they would always complain and say, oh, the media paints us like this, this, and this. And I said, you can't expect. I said, you've been killing Afghans, you've been killing Americans, you've been sending kids to blow themselves up at a checkpoint for 20 years. I said, you can't expect anyone to forgive you overnight. Yeah. You have to show by your actions that you're different, that you're going to change. I said, don't, on the same token, don't expect people are just going to suddenly look at you and think that you maybe aren't as bad as you once were, no matter what image you try to portray, because this is how you're remembered.
Yeah. What you do speaks so loud I can't hear what you say, right? It's one of my favorite quotes. All right, last question, I promise. What have I not asked you that I should have, or that you want to talk about?
Gosh, I think we've kind of covered everything, really. I guess it's just... do I plan to go back? Yes.
Really? How, like soon? Or
yeah, soon. Really? I was just applying for a new visa. Maybe in the spring.
Do your parents have,
my poor parents.
Just like down Pepto or like ulcer treatment, or what? Like, do you just give them? I think
they just, my dad tries to engage with it a little bit more, and they're in Sydney, and they try to my dad tries to kind of stay up with it, and he's very empathetic toward, especially the plight of children and things like that. My mother, who's a kindergarten teacher, she just can't wrap her head around any of it. Can't read it, can't understand it. Just so it's difficult for
Is
them.
it to the point where like she doesn't even want to know when you go, or like just wants to bury her head in the sand?
She wants to bury her head in the sand.
Wow.
Yeah. But then she'll, like, when I was there, especially the couple of days before the fall, she was harassing me. You know, WhatsApp every 5 minutes. Are you okay? You okay? You okay? So, and it's hard on them, but I think I don't know that they'll ever get used to it. I think it's always harder for people on the outside that care about you because everything seems so far away and so foreign and so terrifying when you're only seeing snippets of it on the news. I think it's a lot harder for people on the outside than for you, who's on the inside, who certainly sees the dark side of everything that's happening, but at the same time also sees it's not 24/7 bombing and shooting, and there's a lot of downtime, there's a lot of fun time, there's a lot of camaraderie, and there's a lot of lovely things that happen, and you see the best of people in war. And I think you don't always see that from the outside, so everything looks a lot more terrifying than it is.
Yeah. No, I don't doubt it. For me, it's having had a lot of friends that have lost their lives there, and coming from a community that is very heavily invested, in that region. There's a lot of seeing over the last 6 months, that's been pretty tough to stomach. And, obviously not having been in your shoes, you've seen a lot of things that I, or even a lot of guys from that community haven't seen. I do think it's kind of gotten to the point where you just have to pick, like, it's either, you let happen what's going to happen over there and you do the best to your ability, or you go back over and have this never ending conflict with no real clear-cut goal in mind. And I think that's been one of our biggest problems, is not really having an idea, mental picture, or otherwise, whether it's a description, a line item list of goals or boxes that need to be checked to be considered a mission success that never really existed. And when I think about all the guys that I do know that didn't come home from there, and thinking about, are their lives worth that? I don't think they are.
No, and it's a painful realization. I think someone asked me recently, Australian friend, and said, well, is that, we know a lot of people who served, was it worth it? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't see that right now.
Yeah. On the same token, I think it's important to look at it from a very simple standpoint. Similarly, the reason why I joined the military is that, I'm not in the position of being in our nation's leadership and determining where we go, what we do, why we do it, who we do it with. But all of us volunteer to serve our country in a manner with which our country sees best fit.
Yeah.
And you just have to be okay with that and realize that those people are human. They're going to make mistakes. Some of them are even shitty people.
Yeah.
But you either roger up and volunteer to do that, or you don't. And if you do, you just have to be okay with where they send you and what you do, or you just don't do it. And I don't think it takes away from the level of sacrifice, or that those guys did what was asked of them and went above and beyond it. I don't think it takes away from any of that. And I think if I had to pinpoint the most important distinction to make as far as that goes, is that don't think of guys dying in vain just because their sacrifice wasn't worth the result there.
Yeah.
The fact is that, a lot of things have come out of it that wouldn't have come out of it otherwise, in terms of us not being attacked at home, and the entire, global society, or the entire world, understanding that when America says it's going to do something and not waver, and spend as long as it takes to accomplish whatever they set out to do, they're going to do that, and that is an important thing to be viewed as a
100%. I think Lyndon B. Johnson said, if you say you're going to send a man to hell, you better be sure as hell be ready to have the backup to do it. And at that particular point in time, that was what the U.S. made, and I just hope that we look at Afghanistan and the lessons that come from that. And you could argue with a lot of the same things with Iraq as well, when it comes to the corruption and to, decisions made. And I just hope that we can take some of those lessons and use those for future foreign policy decisions and use those when we are thinking about, should the US go into a country or shouldn't? And if we do, what are the mistakes of the past that we can avoid going forward?
I couldn't agree more. I think we should use a tougher measuring stick in terms of getting involved in places. Not that we shouldn't ever get involved, but I think it just like, say, a street fight, is that I'll use me as an example. Like, there's a lot of times I could get in a fight and I don't. And to me, like, I'm not going to get in a fight unless I absolutely fucking have to, But if I am pushed to that point, there's also going to be zero accommodations made for the feelings of whoever has pushed me to that point, and their safety or livelihood or family or anything. And I think we've learned that lesson historically over the last several millennia. I'd say maybe most recently with Tecumseh Sherman in the Civil War, of saying, hey, I'm going to make this so god-awful for the other side that they're just not even going to want to fight. And to me, once you get to that point, you have to look at it that way. Is that what is the purpose of war? Well, it's to make the other side stop doing whatever they're doing. I view the same thing with prison, is that if prison is supposed to keep people from doing things, then it should be way worse than it is. They shouldn't be have accommodations made to make their lives comfortable. And so with all of that from a principle standpoint, I think needs to be taken into account before we decide to do something and say, we're not going to go do this unless we absolutely have to. But if we do, we're going to use absolutely every resource at our disposal to be so overwhelmingly brutal that people are going to say, we're not going to fuck with that country anymore.
Yeah.
I really do, because war sucks no matter how you skin it. And there's no good way to fight it other than to make it as short as possible, in my opinion. But
yeah, and you look at straight after September 11, just how quickly the U.S. was able to go in and get rid of the Taliban from power, and then I think it's the lack of goals that happened when it was trying to build a nation, and that sort of period of not knowing the right way to do it, and I think that's something for the history books to really look at going forward.
I think we got punched in the mouth and knocked on our ass and decided we have to do something, and fast, and did. And then when we got there, we kind of kicked the can down the road for 20 years and never had a real clear-cut plan as to what success looked like. But
and Afghans themselves really weren't directly responsible for 9/11.
Yeah.
That was Saudis that were flying those planes, and Osama was found in Pakistan. So difficult decisions.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Anything else that you want to bring up from your time being over there?
No, I think I've covered most of it. Other than, I think it's important, just from a journalist point of view, to continue covering a place even when it's not in the headlines anymore. And I think just because the US sort of leaves a place, doesn't mean that we forget about it. And I think people have sacrificed a lot to Afghanistan, and I think that it's important just to really keep telling those stories as best I can, and to not forget it, because it's a big part of our history.
No, agreed. What is next for you other than going back?
I trying to not live out of a backpack, which I've been doing for years. So kind of getting some roots here, and then I'll go back to Afghanistan. I've got some work in Eastern Europe, and then I'd like to go back to Iraq too, which I haven't been to for a couple of years, and Burma as well. So,
is there a 5-year or 10-year? This is where I want to be.
I think so much about, especially when I was in Afghanistan, I was thinking so much about the work, and I just love what I do. I just don't know. I don't know what else I could possibly do that I would love so much, and I think that's something I'm just grateful for. I think so much of our lives we spend trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing, what's meaningful to us, and I'm grateful that it was something that I found very young in life. I don't know again how I'm going to feel in 5 years, but right now I love writing and telling those stories, and I can't envision myself doing anything else. I don't know what else I would do.
Yeah. Well, it shows. You are profoundly gifted at what you do, and I can't thank you enough for doing what you do and being willing to come and share your story here. I think your level of dedication and courage and bravery to be a voice for the people that you are a voice for is absolutely nothing short of inspiring. And I think a lot of, especially in this country, a lot of young kids, boys and girls, should take a page out of your book and hopefully pay attention to you and look up to you, because you're an amazing human. So.
And just one thing I'll add is you just see how incredible humans can be, in the sense of how much people can withstand and rebuild their lives, and we all, I think, have that innate resilience, and you see it when you're in these places, and it's really inspiring to me of how much we can endure and get through and bounce back, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we wrap it up, where can people find any of the stuff that you've written and your coverage? Is there a kind of a collected place with all of it?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Hollie, HOLLIES McKay. I have also a Substack as well, holliesmckay.substack.com, which I put a lot of writings out and links to work as I publish it. And I have my book, Only Cry for the Living, which you can also get. It's from D'Angelo Publications. And I also have, my photographer Jake and I have a beautiful photo book on Afghanistan that's going to come out in the spring. So yeah, it'll be just really, I guess, a coffee table book, really some beautiful photographs, hopefully of parts of Afghanistan that people haven't seen, and just, and I sort of did the writing to go with it.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be neat. Well, good stuff. Well, thank you again. I know you're busy, and you're between Idaho and Virginia, I think, stopping here. So I know we need to get you to the airport. But again, I just can't thank you enough for taking the time, doing what you do, and being willing to share it with us.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thank you. To all the listeners out there, I hope this gained some perspective on what's really going on there. I know for me it has. There's a lot of white noise and bullshit in the media that is not an accurate or true representation of what actually happened. So I feel that interviews like this are excruciatingly important for people to listen to balance out that non-biased perspective that you just get overwhelmed by in the mainstream media. So I hope you got something out of it. If you didn't, joke yourself. And until next time, this is Mic Drop.